So this is called Sunday School for Skeptics. I remind everybody. And I'm going to present a skeptical argument. And we're going to talk about how can we respond to that as Christians. This chapter is called The Authenticity of the Bible, or the Reliability of the Bible. So, this is a quote by Dr. Ellie Arroway, who is a fictional figure in the movie Contact. Contact was written by Carl Sagan, who's a very well-known atheist, but a very well-respected scientist at the same time. And she says in the book about this movie, this quote is actually not in the movie, because I was looking for it, but it's actually in the book. And Ellie Arroway says, what I'm saying is, if God wanted to send us a message and ancient writings were the only way he could think of doing it, he could have done a better job. Okay. And that argument might have carried some weight for me before I had actually looked into that. And one of the first things that you'll find on the American Atheist website when you start to look at what they have to say about the Bible is, it's all a bunch of fiction, it's all stories, and not only that, it conflicts with itself. And that there's no competent scholar that would ever believe that any of that writing could be by a deity, let alone, why should we consider it even as a whole and not just a collection of myths in the sense that they carry no weight. So that's the skeptic's opinion of the Bible. And let's see if I can get this to go all the way down. There we go. Okay. That's right.
You're too tall, you can't get it.
He remembers that quote from a couple of weeks ago. So is the Bible a reliable document? Is it a reliable source of history? Has the Bible been rewritten or modified over the years? Were important ideas copied from older sources? Is it full of conflicts? Those are all questions that the atheist will ask you. Were there changes or errors? Because we know that the printing press wasn't invented until the 16th century, and there was 1,500 years of chance to get it wrong. How do we know they didn't make lots of errors in copying? Everybody had to write everything by hand. How many of you can copy something perfectly in handwriting through 1,000 different iterations with no computer to look at?
That's just the New Testament.
Yeah. And the Old Testament, it's oral history. Okay, what if we decided there was, the Bible is accurate, but how do we know that people didn't get together and say, okay, we both believe this thing, let's just make sure our copies of the Bible say what we're going to believe? All right, how do we know there isn't a group of people that just kind of all got together and colluded or sneaked the Bible in on us in the version that they wanted us to see, just so that they could account for some of these errors? So there's ways to talk about the reliability of the Bible, and I'm gonna break them into two parts, because that's what teachers like to do, break things into parts. So there's internal evidence, which is, and this, by the way, doesn't apply just to the Bible, it applies to any ancient document. Anything that we have from the same period of history or from earlier, anything that's been written down in antiquity, we use these same tests to try to find out how close is the version that we read now to the version that was originally written. And that's called the autographer, by the way. The letter that Paul wrote by Paul's own hand, we don't have today. It's called the autographa. And so how do we know that what we have today looks like what Paul really wrote? The second thing is there's external evidence, which is what the document says about society, about dates, about persons, and about the world that was contemporary or contextual with the time that it was written. So the internal evidence is what the document claims for itself. A document should be internally consistent with regards to things like references, facts, time and places, and events. The content of the document should not contradict itself. There's also a test called the bibliographic test. And this is basically what they call textual criticism. It's the tradition from the original document to the copies and manuscripts that we have today. It's this process of analyzing a document critically. And that's also a scientific process, by the way, and I hope to show you how that works. So that means we start with copies. How many copies are there available of the document? We start with the location. Where were these copies found? We start with time. How much time passed between the original or the autographa and the earliest copies? And what are the differences between all the copies? Okay, let's take a look at that based on the Old Testament, starting with the Old Testament. Okay, what's one of the first things that we know about the Old Testament in the times where it was first conceived or received by the prophets? What do we know about it? Was it printed? It was oral tradition, right. It was told from father to son, from generation to generation. So, until 1948, these were the oldest copies we had of the Old Testament in Hebrew from the time that they were written. We didn't have anything printed or written down that could be dated any earlier than 1,000 years from the time it was first written down. And for the longest time, that was criticism of the Bible, was that how do we know, that what we have in the Old Testament is accurate at all? How do we know that those are the things that were really said or really taught 1,000 years before that? Notice that these words like codex. How many of you know what a codex is? Yeah? Codex? Codex is a book that's bound in the middle that opens, not like this, but yeah, a staple codex. Okay. A codex is a book that opens just like we understand books today. They were bound along one edge. And from codices, you even know that just the form of the book, that book didn't exist in any other form before, the early part of the last century. So these are the famous codices that they have of early Hebrew Scripture. But in one year, I believe it was 1948, they found a Bedouin found a bunch of jars, and you can see, you'll see here in a minute what they look like. They found a bunch of books that were rolled up as scrolls, and they were originally made out of vellum, which is basically goat skin. And they were sewn together into big, long scrolls. And we actually have a complete scroll of the book of Isaiah that was sewn together on animal skins, and it dated to 125 BC, 1,000 years before the earlier codexes. Okay, so if you find something like that, what are you going to do?
Compare it to what other sources have.
Exactly. You're going to run over to the British Museum or wherever you found those other codices, and you're going to say, wow, we have a 1,000-year time warp here. Let's look and see how close they are. By the way, that's a picture of what this looks like. It wasn't in good shape, but you wouldn't be either, having to be in a bottle for 1,000 years. They found it in a bottle that looks just like this.
You don't see the goat.
Yeah. Yeah, the goat's somewhere for breakfast. So this has the whole book in there. Okay, and here's an example of what's written down there. And you can see it's from right to left. And that's what it says. That's what that little fragment says, for example. And I had to go look that up, but because I can't read Hebrew, unlike some people.
Yeah, actually, during when Dylan and I were teaching through Isaiah, I don't know about Dylan, but I was referring to the actual Isaiah scroll. You can search it online. They've got it.
And one of the miracles of modern technology is that they have photographed all of this, and they've actually used X-ray crystallography and all kinds of other techniques to figure out how to read things that are stuck together. And that's a hugely exciting field right now.
There's some, replicated scrolls over at the Lanier Library, right?
Yep.
Yeah, yeah. At one time, they had a replica of the Isaiah scroll sitting over there.
So that's copies, all right? So now we have those copies, and I will just say right now that they compared the copies, and I actually had a quote from there. They found one difference in they found like maybe one difference for every 1,000 words that are written down there. And they're usually things like content variations of things like pronouns and things like, there's one part in Isaiah, I believe, that, let me look it up here to see if I have it. Where basically, I believe it's in Isaiah, where they make statements where, about the prophecy of Jesus, where he said he was raised to see again the light of life. Well, the words light of life are not in the oldest manuscripts. So that was something that somebody added during the newest manuscripts. But it doesn't say Jesus wasn't raised. It doesn't say anything about the prophecy. It put in a detail there. And that could have been by a copyist who decided that it was important to clarify this issue, but it didn't change the meaning of it at all.
Scott, before you jump off on the location, I think just to give people an idea of the timeline and make sure they're clear on this, when you're talking about oral tradition, basically the idea is from the time of the beginning of history up until about the year 1446, there is no written form of biblical text at all. It's at 1446 to 1406 BC.
Except maybe Job.
Sorry?
Except maybe Job.
Maybe Job. But in terms of actually documenting the history of mankind up until the Exodus, that documentation is not done until between 1446 and 1406 BC. So what Scott's saying is you have to, from starting zero up until that point, a lot of what they're getting is passing down these stories until you get to Moses, and then Moses is having to go back as a prophet of God to clarify and clean up a history that's been jacked with for thousands of years up until that point. And that's where we get our, excluding Job possibly, but that's where we get our first formal documentation. Then the problem we have is, as those texts are being copied and passed down for 1,400 years, we lose copies along the way. They can't handle the elements, they fall apart. And so what we ended up with over the course of time is all we had left were documents that we could only date back to the 900s AD until we discovered the Qumran documents, which then pushed what we have available to us. I'm sorry?
In Hebrew.
In Hebrew, and in Hebrew all the way back to 125 BC. So I just want to make sure you're clear on that, the Old Testament was written down prior to 125 by all means. We just don't have copies in hand of what's left over of that. So.
Thank you. That's good. And there, you could do a whole class on nothing but the Qumran finds. And so as a necessity, I'm going to gloss over some of this. But again, we've got some people in here that know a lot about this too. And it's a plug for CDI, because I think you do a class on it.
Yeah, our whole first weekend, when you start with us, is this stuff. Clarifying this stuff, so getting more in depth.
So let's talk about location. We know that the original document, or the writings of Moses, were placed in the Ark of the Covenant. We know that because Deuteronomy says that. All right? You can look it up, 31:24-26. We know that it was kept in the temple while it existed, but it was lost after the destruction of Herod's temple in 70 AD. And existing manuscripts that we have are from the diaspora, or the spread. And you could say that that was something God had in mind too, because they got spread all over the place. And if there were collusion, we would expect to find differences in the copies that came from Syria versus the ones that came from Mesopotamia versus all of these other locations where they found documents. And then finally, the Septuagint, and if I remember that correctly, that was Greek, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And that was in the library, the Great Library of Alexandria.
Ptolemy Philadelphos is the one. Josephus gives the most accurate recording of that if you want to read his Antiquities of the Jews.
And that's the first full document that we have of the Old Testament, the first full one. And that's the Greek one that you were talking about, not a Hebrew one. And part of the reason is because the librarians in Alexandria felt like the whole world doesn't know Hebrew, but the whole world needs to know this. So we're going to translate it. And they got the best minds in the world to translate this whole document.
I think it's important with what Jeremy was clarifying earlier. When we say we don't have a copy of the Old Testament until 900 for a long time, that's only in Hebrew. We actually do have older copies of the Old Testament, but they're in Greek. And it's from that Septuagint tradition. So we've had it for a long time. In fact, the early church, their Old Testament for a lot of times was they were using the Greek translation. Sort of like how we use the ESV or the NASB. They were using the Septuagint as their go-to Bible in the Greek-speaking world.
Plenty of quotations in the New Testament of Old Testament works are in the Septuagint.
Right. I'm going to get to that too in a minute here. So the Old Testament was written sometime in that range, and nobody's sure until the discovery of the Qumran or Dead Sea Scrolls. The oldest complete the Old Testament was in 900 AD in Hebrew. The copies that we got from Qumran moved that forward to 125 BC. And therefore, the real reliability is reinforced because we compared it. Well, how did it turn out that they lasted 1,000 years without making any substantial changes? How could that possibly be? How come there isn't some other explanation? Well, there's a very good explanation, which is the way they made the copies and who made the copies. Okay, these were called Masoretes. They're very dedicated, methodical, and particular and meticulous copyists. And they were all Jews, and they held that this was the Word of God, so that they had to treat it with utmost respect and care and handling. So, as we've said, the importance of the Qumran find lies in its comparison with these Masoretic texts of the 10th century AD. Now, if we find out that there's not much difference between the two, that says two things. Number one, it says the Masoretes did a pretty good job of perpetuating what they had already been charged to do. And the second is it says that there has not been any substantial changes, which is something that we wanted to know. In most cases, the text is, and this is what I was trying to say earlier, the text is word for word identical to today's standard Hebrew Bible in more than 95% of the text. It doesn't mean there's no changes at all, but I would say that that's also an apologetic for the Bible. If God had dictated every word to every person that wrote the Bible and it was always the same, then we would start to wonder, why wouldn't God have just told us that? Come down in a miracle and told us that. But you remember what happened to Moses. God did come down and tell him that. And Moses didn't even get down to the bottom of the mountain before they were worshiping a golden calf. Okay? So why didn't God make it more clear? Why didn't he start a neon sign in outer space that orbited the moon and it had the Old Testament commandments there? God knows us. So there's a 5% variation that consists of obvious slips of the pens and spelling variations. Isaiah 53:11, which was the verse I was trying to find before in that Isaiah scroll. I didn't trust myself that I'd actually included this slide. That the scribes who copied, how do we know that the scribes who copied didn't make mistakes? Okay, here were their rules for copying. A synagogue roll must be written on the skins of clean animals. must be prepared for the use of the synagogue by a Jew, must be fastened together with strings taken from clean animals. Every skin must contain a certain number of columns equal throughout the entire codex. The length of each column must not extend for less than 48 or more than 60 lines, and the breadth must consist of 30 letters. The whole copy must be first lined, in other words, underlined. And if 3 words be written without a line, you have to throw it away and start it again.
Sorry, I didn't quite parse that.
If the whole copy must be first lined, in other words, we're going to draw underlines like school papers, which they did. If any 3 words be written that don't have a line under them, then the copy's no good and has to be thrown away. Alignment was really important.
I don't understand.
So basically what they do is they take a tool and put it on a ruler and they score the paper. So it creates kind of a slight indentation. And then, unlike like we would underline to do that, in Hebrew they actually do it above the line, and the Hebrew letters drop down from the line. So all they're doing is scoring it so that the letters themselves will look straight across the page. I mean, they look like print. If you see one now done by professionals,
And the reason that the reason that they established that rule, in my opinion, I think, is because if you drop a letter below a line, there could be some misunderstanding about the meaning of what they wrote.
Basically, it's the manual rules for font and typeface
Right.
that developed into those things we have today on word processors.
Right.
We just had to
The ink,
basically do it with straight edges and whatnot.
right? They had to use black ink or no other color. Had to be prepared according to a particular recipe, which is basically the rules that they use for ink nowadays for archival storage. An authentic copy must be the exemplar. In other words, you have to have an already authenticated copy to start with, from which the transcriber not in the least should deviate. No word or letter, not even a yod, must be written from memory. You have to look at every letter from the one that you're copying.
in fact, they have to say the letter that they're about to write down, every single letter they do, as they're going through.
What is a yod? Is that
The
a
yod,
word?
it's like a y sound in Hebrew.
Oh.
Jot
Jot and tittle.
in Greek, jot and tittle.
Every consonant has to have a particular space, at least a space in between. They must have miraculously anticipated OCR. Every consonant, every new parasha or section had to be the breadth of 9 consonants. Between every book, 3 lines. The 5th book of Moses must terminate exactly with a line, but the rest not need do so. The copyist must sit in full Jewish dress. He must wash his whole body. And he must not begin to write the name of God, Yahweh, with a pen newly dipped in ink. So some of these things are kind of amusing that we see. Should a king address him while writing that name, he must take no notice. So everything about honoring the Word of God and about being faithful to the text. So let's talk about the New Testament. Let's use these same requirements here. It turns out there's over 4,000 ancient Greek manuscripts. Now they're not complete copies, some of those are fragments, but there are 4,000 examples of Greek from where all or portions of the New Testament have survived to our time.
That number's up at 6,000 now.
Well, it says we also have 13,000 copies of portions of the New Testament in Greek. So if we compare this with other historical writings, okay, these are some of the copies that we have nowadays. All right, the Magdalene Papyrus, these are the dates. It could be as early as 30 to 70 AD. Disputed, 200 is pretty much what everybody agrees on. Again, that's a fragment. The Rylands Papyrus, and we'll talk about a little bit more. This is the earliest fragment of the New Testament that we have in Greek written on papyrus, and it dates from about 125 AD. They do that by comparing the writing style and the shape of the letters and the things of other things that they know about that are originated in that period. All of these bits and pieces of the New Testament are in museums. They're all extremely important for reasons that we'll get to in a minute. Okay, so compare that with scraps that we have from other ancient books. Here's a list of 20 some odd books that we have from other periods of time that were sort of contemporary with Old and New Testament writings. And notice how many copies that they have. And notice the difference between the copies and the autographa. Very few of them have less than 1,000 years difference between the latest, the earliest copy we have and the number of copies. And look at how small the numbers of copies are. Now, way down at the bottom here, look at all of the evidence we have for the New Testament. We have over 24,000 copies and fragments of the New Testament, and some of them are within 25 years of the time they were written, according to the most optimistic estimates, and no more than 100 years after it's written, even to consensus of skeptics. And here's some examples of codices. Again, the Codex Sinaiticus.
You can search that one online too.
Mm-hmm. The Codex Alexandrinus. This is the one we were talking about earlier that was written in the Library of Alexandria. The Codex Vaticanus, which is the earliest Latin, I believe, is it?
It's
Greek. I'm sorry, this is Greek. The Codex, I haven't got to that yet. The Codex, what was the Latin one? The Vulgate. The Vulgate was the earliest one we have, right? So yeah, this is Greek. And, the reasons they called this Vaticanus is because it's in the Vatican right now. The Catholics have this copy. And this is their oldest extant Greek copy.
And by the way, there's nothing secretive or weird about that text. It's actually a very, very good manuscript representative of the New Testament.
Yep, you can search that one too online.
Mm-hmm.
Every page.
Which you couldn't do, actually, when I started this study 10 years ago. So the web has been a wonderful thing. Here's some copies of early manuscripts. This is the Chester Beatty Papyrus in the British Museum. And this is a piece of Paul's letter to the Romans. And this one, the Rylands Papyrus, this is the oldest one that we know about. And it's a very small fragment. And it contains, we know, John 18:31 through 33. And on the backside, it contains 37 to 38. I thought that was really interesting. And so I had to do, being the skeptic that I was, this happened years ago, I fired up Microsoft Word 2.0 or whatever it was at the time. And I found online a Greek translation, or an Aramaic translation of this text that was in a font that looked similar to these. This is basically all caps, I believe, all capital letters, which was how this was made. And I pasted that into, and this is actually a screenshot from my Word document. And what I wanted to see was, do these letters line up with the boundaries of that fragment? And so I actually pasted the whole chapter in there and then kind of adjusted the margins until it came close to, a paper size. And I had to fiddle with it a little bit, but without changing the pagination, with just a single page break between these two pages, this is what the shape came like. And to me, I thought that was pretty amazing. That said to me, hey, this really was something that came from a page that was written on both sides and had exactly what we have today written on it. And that was the key to how important this particular fragment is. That's how we know that what we have, even from a tiny fragment, has survived all of those years intact and without changes in meaning, is because we can compare all of those fragments. That's one way. What's another way we know? We know because the New Testament has been quoted in other works from ancient history thousands of times. Here's a list of all the writers that we know about and how many times they've quoted the Gospels and which Gospels they are. If you were to, for some reason, the British Museum was to burn down and all the other museums that contain fragments were to burn down, and we lost every single Old Testament and New Testament scrap that we have, you could reconstruct nearly the entire book just from quotes from other authors that lived at or near the same times as the ones that were written down.
Those are all 2nd and 3rd century AD church fathers that you have.
Also, interestingly, when you're talking about that papyrus you were looking at, the Rylands, we actually have a scrap that was discovered recently of the Gospel of Mark. And their current running theory is that if it's not a copy of the original, it's a copy of the original. So they're thinking it could potentially become, they're still doing research on it, trying to figure out all the background, etc. But it has the potential to become the oldest fragment we have, and it would date from 50 years before this one, which is super ancient world news flash. So that's very, very helpful.
So the other thing, location, where were copies of the New Testament found? Well, here's sort of a Google Maps version of all of these important finds, and you can see they're from all over the Middle East. And what does that say about it? It basically says that if they're widely scattered, it's very unlikely that people at different parts of the world got together and colluded and said that we're going to tweak it to make it say what we want. Okay, so we talked about this. They have actually the nearest complete New Testament Greek manuscripts we have of entire books or entire letters are within about 300 or 400 years of the original autograph.
You can with the manuscript evidence we have, you can reconstruct probably 2/3 to 3/4 of the New Testament by about the year 250 with what we have, and then you can reconstruct the entire New Testament by 300 to 400.
Okay, these are quotes of the New Testament from contemporary writers of the time. Again, the same thing applies. So the original translation of the Latin Vulgate, 384 to 400 AD. One thing that I'm not going to talk about this week, but is, okay, how do we know all of this is the Bible, and how do we know it's true? Because there were a lot of documents that were made, a lot of so-called Gospels at the time that were also carried around as being part of the Bible or part of Scriptures. Some of them were important, some of them were heresy. And the Catholic Church has included a few of them, which they recognize as not being authentic. They call them the Apocrypha, or the, is that right? The Apocrypha, and which basically means not, its authorship is not reliable. And it turns out that all of the believers that were around in the 5th century got together and had these councils where they decided it's time, all of the people who wrote these books have died, and all the people that knew the people who wrote these books have died. And we're starting to see these kind of bad ideas creep in that conflict with the historical belief of the Christian faith. So we're going to hold these councils and try to get together and decide what should be in the Bible, what books should be in the Bible. That whole thing is called the canon, the Bible canon. And it's basically things that were agreed upon, and as Norman Geisler says, they were discovered by man. The canon was discovered. It wasn't created by man. It was discovered. And the reason he said that is because we can look at those 66 books of the Bible and we can recognize, yes, that's Christianity. We know, and that the church fathers have already written to us for decades or for centuries, and we know what that means. So because of what we already know about Christianity, we can decide what books go in the Bible and which ones don't. In fact, they even decided to a great conservative point that basically, when in doubt, throw it out. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you know that even Hebrews got almost thrown out of one of those lists of the canonical documents because nobody could say exactly who the author was.
Nobody of that day could.
Nobody of that day, right. And there's still some disagreement today.
There is.
Okay. And again, another plug for the CDI class. I'm sure you will talk about it. Okay, and then finally there's some external evidence. I only have 5 minutes to talk about this, so I'm going to rush through it. This is how the document squares or aligns itself with facts, dates, persons, etc. from the contemporary world. There hasn't been any archaeological find, and as long as we know, that's ever contradicted facts and events of people of the Bible that weren't described accurately in the Bible, from what we can tell. And this actually is a very good book that describes these archaeological finds. I threw that in here because he's actually done a greater job of popularizing this than anybody else. He is a young Earth creationist, but that doesn't mean that anybody should think any more or any less of what he's written in this book, which is he did a great job on this. Some things that we have, these are these are called the Ebla tablets, and these are talking about cities and places they're mentioned in the Old Testament, and it's the earliest thing that's been written down that even mentions the city of Jerusalem. Now, this isn't a scripture. This is basically like looking at somebody's discarded checkbook records. All right, it's just everyday life. But the interesting thing is that all of those things that they found about everyday life from this set of stone tablets is the same as what was described in the New Testament, and it very much aligned with it. You can see, I believe it's written in like cuneiform, and it's one of the most ancient languages that we have an example of that survives today. This is something that's very interesting. This wasn't discovered until 1961. And before that, nobody believed, outside of people that trusted the Bible reference, nobody believed that Pilate actually existed at the same time as Tiberius Caesar. And this is this is a cornerstone from a monument that Pilate built dedicated to Tiberius. And what's interesting about it is because nobody thought that anything like this would exist, because number one, Caesar Tiberius didn't want anybody building monuments for him. But number two, it turns out that we know from the Bible description of Pilate that he was probably the kind of guy that would suck up to anybody. And that's exactly what this is. And this actually says both Tiberius, which nails down the date, and Pontius Pilate, the prefect. So there's a very important historical benchmark. The other thing that nobody knew about was, until fairly recently, was this, that people had actually been crucified, as they described in the New Testament. We've seen that in popular culture. We don't have a hard time believing this, but archaeologically, it was unsubstantiated. Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. Number one, because of what time does to human bodies and to iron. But they actually did find a heel bone with a nail through it. And there's a mock-up of what the original bones would have looked like. So you can compare to see what part of the foot that was. Not only that, they found just this year in June of 2018 another example of a crucifixion. And I couldn't find any pictures of it because I think it's like being analyzed or whatever. But that, again, we can see that's fairly come up. Now, there's one more thing I'd like to talk about before we cut loose, and that's this thing called the James Ossuary. And how many of you have ever heard of this? Okay, it turns out in the 80s, the Israeli Antiquities Authority found a collection of bones in ossuaries that had names of people mentioned, like James, the son of Joseph, the brother of Jesus. It actually had that inscription. And if you remember, if you'd ever encountered this in the news, you'll find out that everybody was really excited about it for about a year or so. And then all of a sudden, some guy came along and said, "No, this is a forgery. It's an authentication. It's an authentication failure. He's put some false patina in here, and it shows that he's obviously carved this on here." Well, if you follow up on this, there's still a lot of controversy on this. It hasn't been concluded one way or the other. Not only that, they found some other ossuaries or bone boxes in this find that were related to other people that could be family members of Jesus. And there's a lot of controversy on it. And as far as I'm concerned, the jury is still out. They've done each time they come up with some new forensic technique to figure out how to analyze this, it just creates more questions.
Well, I'd like to say, I mean, it's all well and good, but the truth is, these names are extremely common back then.
Right.
So you shouldn't get too excited if you see Jesus, Yeshua, or Yosef, or James' name, which has different variations. Actually, on there in the French, it's Jacques.
Yeah.
It says right there above it, Jacques, fils de Joseph, which is son of Joseph.
Right, and that's one of the reasons not to get too excited. But the other reason that you should get excited is because somebody has actually done a statistical analysis of what are the chances that in this location at this time, 5 people with the names matching those. There's one of them inscription that has Mary's name on it, and another one that has Martha's name on it. And if you add all of those together, what are the chances they should all show up in the same bone box at the same time? So there's some real interesting things going on there, and I don't know the answer to that yet, but I'm excited about it. Okay, so here's the real thing. Is the Bible inspired? If the 66 books of the modern Bible were not the Word of God, an accurate record of the witness and teachings delivered through the apostles and by those who directly follow them, it would seem much less likely that we would have such a consensus on all of the evidence today, on all the scientific evidence today. The canon, which is the authoritative contents of the written Bible, was first inspired by God, then discovered and acknowledged by God's people. It wasn't that people decided. And that counters the argument by skeptics that we all just figured out what was in the Bible and we just put it together like a good story. Couldn't have happened that way. The Bible is a reliable document. It's been accepted by believers since the time of the apostles for 2,000 years, by Christians time and time again through the centuries as presenting the accurate teaching of Christ, the Word of God.